The Blackwood Mansion stood like a monument to old American wealth, its Gothic revival architecture cutting an imposing silhouette against the overcast Massachusetts sky. Built in 1847 by railroad baron Cornelius Blackwood, the estate had witnessed generations of prosperity, scandal, and carefully buried secrets. Now, in the autumn of 2024, its current inhabitants moved through its halls like ghosts haunting their own lives. Elspeth Morrison had called this place home for 12 years, though the word home felt like a cruel joke. At 23, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that might have graced magazine covers in another life. Auburn hair that caught light like copper wire, green eyes that held depths of unspoken pain, and a slender frame that seemed to fold in on itself whenever Julian Blackwood entered a room. She had arrived here as an 11-year-old orphan, the daughter of her Aunt Margaret's late sister, taken in not out of love, but out of a rigid sense of familial duty that the Blackwood matriarch wore like expensive jewelry. Margaret Blackwood ruled the household with the iron fist of New England propriety. At 58, she had perfected the art of cruelty disguised as charity, her silver hair pulled back in a perpetual chignon that seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. She had never let Elspeth forget that her presence in the mansion was an act of benevolence, not belonging. "You must earn your place here, child," she would say, her voice carrying the chill of a Boston winter. "Nothing in this world comes without a price." The price had been Elspeth's childhood, her dreams, and now, seemingly, her future. Margaret had arranged for her to marry Julian upon his 25th birthday, a transaction disguised as family unity. Julian, now 24, was everything his mother had molded him to be. Entitled, calculating, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He stood 6 feet tall, with the kind of classical features that photographers love, dark hair swept back with pomade, and blue eyes that held all the warmth of Arctic ice. When he looked at Elspeth, she felt like cattle being appraised at market. "You're lucky, you know," Julian had told her just 3 days ago, cornering her in the library, where she sought refuge among dusty first editions. His voice carried that particular New England accent that spoke of old money and older traditions. "Most girls in your position would be grateful for such an arrangement. You'll want for nothing as my wife." The way he said, "wife," made her skin crawl, as if he were discussing the acquisition of a particularly fine piece of furniture. That evening, as rain lashed against the mansion's tall windows and thunder rolled across the Berkshire hills, Elspeth had climbed the narrow servants' staircase to the attic. It was the one place in the house where she felt truly alone, where the weight of expectation couldn't reach her. The space was cramped and dusty, filled with trunks of forgotten belongings and furniture draped in white sheets like sleeping phantoms. A single window looked out over the estate's sprawling grounds, now lost in darkness and storm. The wooden floorboards creaked under her knees as she knelt in the center of the room. Her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. The sound of rain on the roof above was like 1,000 tiny drums, drowning out the world below. Here, surrounded by the detritus of lives long past, she felt she could speak honestly to whatever force might be listening. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I don't know what else to do. I don't know where else to turn." Tears had begun to track down her cheeks, leaving glistening trails in the dim light that filtered through the dusty window. "I can't marry him. I can't live like this anymore. Please, if there's any justice in this world, any mercy left in heaven, give me a way out." The words poured from her like water from a broken dam, years of suppressed fear and desperation finally finding voice. She spoke of her loneliness, of nights lying awake dreading her future, of the way Julian's eyes undressed her whenever he thought no one was looking. She spoke of her aunt's cold indifference, of feeling like a prisoner in silk and satin, of dreams that withered a little more each day under the weight of inevitable reality. Lightning illuminated the attic in stark, brief moments, casting her shadow large and distorted against the slanted walls. In those flashes, she looked like a supplicant in some ancient ritual, her desperation made manifest in the play of light and darkness. The storm raged on, as if nature itself were responding to the turmoil in her heart. "I don't ask for riches or fame," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I just want to be free. Free to choose my own path, to love who I want to love, to be more than just a pawn in someone else's game." The thunder seemed to answer her, a low rumble that shook the very bones of the house. She stayed there until the storm began to subside, until her tears had dried and her voice had grown hoarse from pleading with the darkness. When she finally rose from her knees, her legs were stiff and her heart felt strangely hollow, as if she had poured everything she had into the night and had nothing left to give. As she made her way back down the narrow staircase, the house seemed different somehow, charged with an energy she couldn't quite name. The portraits of long-dead Blackwoods seemed to watch her with new interest, their painted eyes following her progress through the dimly lit corridors. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed midnight as she passed, its deep bronze voice echoing through the silence like a funeral bell. She prayed alone in the attic, pouring her heart out to whatever forces might hear her desperate plea for freedom. She had asked for deliverance from a fate worse than death, for escape from the golden cage that had become her prison. What she hadn't expected was for her prayers to be answered in such a dramatic and terrifying way. By morning, everything would change, and Elspeth would discover that sometimes the most desperate prayers carry the most dangerous consequences. Dawn broke grey and sullen over the Blackwood estate, the kind of New England morning that promised rain and delivered disappointment. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of scattered leaves and broken branches, as if nature itself had fought a battle during the night. Inside the mansion, the usual morning routine began with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. Coffee brewing in the kitchen, newspapers delivered to the front door, and Margaret Blackwood's sharp voice calling for Julian to join her for breakfast. But Julian didn't answer. Mrs. Henley, the head housekeeper who had served the Blackwood family for 30 years, knocked gently on the young master's door at 7:30, as she had every morning since he was a boy. When silence greeted her, she knocked harder. Still nothing. Her weathered hands trembling slightly, she turned the brass handle and pushed the door open, expecting to find Julian sleeping off another night of drinking with his Harvard friends. The bed was empty, its covers undisturbed. The window stood wide open, cool morning air billowing the expensive silk curtains like ghostly dancers. Julian's clothes from the previous evening lay neatly folded on his valet stand, his gold pocket watch still ticking on the nightstand, his wallet untouched. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. "Mrs. Blackwood!" Mrs. Henley's voice cracked as she hurried down the grand staircase, her sensible shoes echoing against the marble steps. "Mrs. Blackwood, you need to come quickly." Margaret was in the morning room, already dressed in her customary black dress, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. She was reading the Boston Globe with the same intensity she brought to everything in her life, a cup of Earl Grey steaming beside her untouched breakfast. When Mrs. Henley burst in, her usual composure cracked for just a moment. "What is the meaning of this disruption, Mrs. Henley?" Margaret's voice could have frozen water in July, but the housekeeper pressed on. "It's Master Julian, ma'am. He's not in his room. His bed hasn't been slept in. And the window is wide open." The newspaper crumpled in Margaret's hands as she rose, her face draining of colour. "What do you mean, not in his room? Julian doesn't rise before 9. He must be—" "I've checked everywhere, ma'am. The library, the study, the conservatory. He's nowhere to be found." Margaret's world tilted on its axis. Julian was her life's work, her greatest achievement, the heir who would carry the Blackwood name into the next generation. He was supposed to marry Elspeth in 6 months, produce the next generation of Blackwoods, and maintain the family's position in Boston society. He was her insurance against irrelevance, her guarantee that the Blackwood legacy would endure. "Call Thompson," she commanded, referring to the estate's groundskeeper. "Have him search the grounds immediately. Check the stables, the greenhouse, every outbuilding. Julian may have had too much brandy last night and wandered outside." But even as she gave the orders, Margaret knew something was terribly wrong. Julian was many things, arrogant, entitled, occasionally cruel, but he wasn't reckless. He understood his place in the world and the responsibilities that came with being the sole heir to a fortune built over 5 generations. He wouldn't simply disappear without word. By 9 o'clock, the entire household was in chaos. Thompson had combed every inch of the grounds with his 2 assistants, finding nothing but Julian's footprints leading from the back terrace toward the woods. Footprints that simply stopped at the tree line, as if he had been plucked from the earth itself. The local police had been called, though Margaret insisted on speaking only to Chief Harrison, a man whose family had served the Blackwoods in various capacities for decades. Chief Harrison arrived within the hour, a stocky man in his 50s with kind eyes and a patient demeanor that had served him well in dealing with the eccentricities of wealthy families. He examined Julian's room with the thoroughness of someone who understood that rich people's problems required delicate handling. "No signs of struggle," he noted, running his fingers along the window frame. "No blood, no evidence of forced entry. The window could have been opened from inside or outside." He turned to Margaret, who stood rigid as a statue in the doorway. "Has Julian been under any particular stress lately? Financial troubles? Romantic entanglements?" Margaret's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Julian is to inherit one of the largest fortunes in New England. What stress could he possibly have?" It was then that Elspeth appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion despite her better judgment. She looked pale and drawn, her usual attempts to remain invisible complicated by the extraordinary circumstances. Margaret's cold gaze fixed on her immediately. "Elspeth." Margaret's voice carried a new edge of suspicion. "Where were you last night during the storm?" "In my room, Aunt Margaret," Elspeth replied quietly, though her heart had begun to race. "I went to bed early." "Mrs. Henley," Margaret snapped, without taking her eyes off Elspeth, "did you see Elspeth in her room last night?" The housekeeper wrung her hands nervously. "Well, no, ma'am. I don't usually check on Miss Elspeth after dinner unless specifically asked." Chief Harrison watched this exchange with growing interest. In his experience, family dynamics often held the key to understanding mysterious disappearances. "Miss Morrison," he said gently, "did you see or hear anything unusual last night? Any sounds from Julian's room or elsewhere in the house?" Elspeth's mind raced. She couldn't tell them about the attic, about her desperate prayers, about the way she had pleaded for deliverance from her arranged fate. How could she explain that she had spent hours begging for Julian's absence without sounding like she had somehow caused it? "I heard the storm," she said carefully. "It was very loud. I don't think I would have heard anything else over the thunder and rain." Margaret stepped closer, her presence looming like a dark cloud. "How convenient. The one person in this house who benefits most from Julian's absence claims to have heard nothing." "Aunt Margaret, I would never—" "Wouldn't you?" Margaret's voice was razor-sharp now. "You've made no secret of your distaste for the marriage arrangement. Perhaps you decided to take matters into your own hands." Chief Harrison held up a calming hand. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Mrs. Blackwood. These are early hours yet. Young men sometimes make impulsive decisions. Has Julian ever left without notice before?" But Margaret wasn't listening. Her eyes remained fixed on Elspeth with laser-like intensity, as if she could peer into the girl's soul and extract the truth by force of will alone. In her mind, the pieces were already falling into place. The orphan who had everything to gain from Julian's disappearance, the convenient storm that would have covered any sounds, the lack of witnesses to Elspeth's whereabouts. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the mansion's tall windows, but it brought no warmth to the Blackwood estate. Julian was gone, and with his disappearance, The carefully constructed world of tradition and expectation had begun to crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. The search for Julian Blackwood consumed the next 48 hours like a fever. Police officers combed through the dense Massachusetts woods that bordered the estate, their voices calling his name until the sound became meaningless. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors chopping through the crisp October air, while search dogs followed scent trails that led nowhere. The local news stations picked up the story by day 2. Their vans lined up outside the mansion's gates like mechanical vultures, waiting for tragedy to unfold. Margaret Blackwood moved through it all with the mechanical precision of a woman holding herself together through sheer force of will. She coordinated with authorities, fielded calls from concerned society friends, and maintained the facade of the grieving aunt, even as her suspicions crystallized around Elspeth like ice forming on a winter pond. Every interaction between them crackled with unspoken accusations. "The FBI will be here this afternoon," Margaret announced during a tense breakfast on the 3rd day, her voice cutting through the morning silence like a blade. "They're treating this as a potential kidnapping." She set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision, her eyes never leaving Elspeth's face. Of course, they'll want to interview everyone in the household, thoroughly. Elspeth's stomach churned, but she forced herself to meet her aunt's gaze. "I'll tell them everything I know, which is nothing." "Nothing," Margaret repeated, tasting the word like poison. "How remarkable that you know nothing about the disappearance of the man you were supposed to marry. Some might find that convenient." The weight of suspicion had begun to crush Elspeth's spirit. She found herself analyzing every word, every gesture, every moment of silence for how it might be interpreted by others. When she retreated to her room, she felt like a prisoner awaiting trial. When she emerged for meals, the household staff watched her with a mixture of pity and fear, as if she carried some contagious guilt. It was Mrs. Henley who unwittingly provided the thread that would begin to unravel everything. On the 3rd afternoon, as FBI agents combed through Julian's room with forensic precision, she approached Chief Harrison with the hesitant air of someone carrying unwelcome news. "Chief Harrison," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "There's something I think you should know about the night Master Julian disappeared." Harrison looked up from his notes, his weathered face creased with concentration. "What is it, Mrs. Henley?" "Well, it's about Miss Elspeth. She said she was in her room all evening, but—" Mrs. Henley wrung her hands nervously. "I was having trouble sleeping because of the storm, you see. Around 11:30 I got up to check that all the windows were properly latched. That's when I saw her." "Saw her where?" "Coming down from the 3rd floor, from the direction of the attic stairs." Mrs. Henley's voice dropped to a whisper. She looked like she'd been crying. Her dress was dusty, and she was carrying her shoes. Harrison felt the familiar tingle that came with a significant breakthrough. "Did she see you?" "No, sir. I stayed in the shadows, but I'm certain it was her. I've known that girl since she was 11 years old." Within an hour, Harrison and 2 FBI agents were climbing the narrow staircase to the mansion's attic. The space was exactly as Elspeth had left it 3 nights ago, dusty, cramped, and filled with the accumulated memories of generations. But now it felt different, charged with the weight of what had happened since her desperate prayer. Agent Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who specialized in missing persons cases, examined the floor with her flashlight. "Look here," she said, pointing to distinct impressions in the dust. "Knee prints. Someone was kneeling here for an extended period." She photographed the marks from multiple angles, noting how fresh they appeared despite the layer of dust that covered everything else. "And here," added her partner, Agent Rodriguez, indicating a small, clear area near the window. "Looks like tear stains in the dust. Someone was crying here recently." Harrison felt the pieces clicking into place with the inevitability of a falling domino chain. "Mrs. Henley saw Elspeth coming down from here around 11:30 the night Julian disappeared. She said the girl had been crying and looked disheveled." Agent Chen bagged samples of the dust and photographed everything methodically. We'll need to question her again, obviously, but this puts her in a very different position than she initially claimed. When they confronted Elspeth an hour later in the mansion's formal sitting room, her composure finally cracked. Margaret sat across from her like a judge awaiting a verdict, while the investigators arranged themselves with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to extracting truth from lies. "Miss Morrison," Agent Chen began, her voice professionally neutral, "we have evidence that places you in the attic on the night Julian disappeared. Why didn't you mention this during your initial interview?" Elspeth's hands trembled in her lap as the weight of discovery settled over her. I didn't think it was relevant." "You didn't think it was relevant?" Margaret's voice rose, like a church organ hitting a high note. "You lied to the police about your whereabouts on the night my nephew vanished, and you don't think it's relevant?" "I didn't lie," Elspeth said desperately. "I was in the house. I needed somewhere quiet to think." "Think about what?" Harrison asked, his tone gentler than the others, but no less probing. The truth hung in the air like smoke, toxic and inescapable. Elspeth looked around the room at the faces watching her, Margaret's cold fury, the investigator's professional suspicion, Mrs. Henley's uncomfortable sympathy, and realized that her world was collapsing around her regardless of her innocence or guilt. The very thing she had prayed for, Julian's absence, had become the rope with which she would hang. "I was praying," she whispered finally, the words falling like stones into still water. "I was praying for a way out of the marriage. I was praying for freedom." She looked directly at Margaret, her green eyes blazing with newfound defiance. "I was praying for Julian to disappear from my life forever." The confession hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret's face had gone ashen, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking to reveal the fury beneath. Agent Chen exchanged glances with her partner, both recognizing the significance of what they had just heard. But Elspeth wasn't finished. "You want to know what I was really doing that night?" she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I was on my knees in that dusty attic, begging God to save me from a marriage that felt like a death sentence. I was crying so hard I could barely breathe, praying for any escape from a future that terrified me more than dying. So yes, I prayed for Julian to disappear, but I didn't make him disappear." Margaret stood slowly, her movements rigid with barely controlled rage. "You ungrateful little—" "Enough," Chief Harrison interrupted firmly. "Mrs. Blackwood, please sit down. Miss Morrison, I need you to tell us exactly what happened that night. Every detail." For the next 2 hours, Elspeth recounted her story with painful honesty. She described the years of emotional abuse disguised as charity, Julian's increasingly aggressive advances, the suffocating weight of expectations she never chose. She told them about climbing to the attic during storms because it was the only place she felt truly alone, about the desperation that had driven her to her knees that particular night. "I stayed up there until after midnight," she said, her voice hoarse from talking. "When I came down, the house was completely quiet. I went straight to my room and didn't leave until morning." Agent Rodriguez had been taking detailed notes throughout her statement. "Miss Morrison, in your prayers that night, did you ask for Julian to be harmed?" "No," Elspeth said firmly. "I asked for freedom. I asked for a way out. I never wished him harm. I just wanted him gone from my life." It was Agent Chen who asked the question that changed everything. "Miss Morrison, in all your time living here, have you ever explored the mansion's hidden spaces? Secret passages, concealed rooms, anything like that?" Elspeth blinked in confusion. "Hidden spaces? I don't understand." Margaret's reaction was immediate and telling. The older woman stiffened as if struck, her eyes darting to Agent Chen with something approaching panic. "There are no hidden spaces in this house. That's ridiculous." But Chief Harrison had caught the look, and 30 years of police work had taught him to recognize when someone was hiding something significant. "Mrs. Blackwood, perhaps you could show us around the house, give us a complete tour." "That's entirely unnecessary," Margaret said quickly. "You've already searched every room." Agent Chen stood, her instincts fully engaged now. Actually, Mrs. Blackwood, we'd appreciate your cooperation, especially given the historical nature of this house. Many homes from this period were built with interesting architectural features. What followed was a systematic examination of the mansion that revealed secrets the Blackwood family had kept hidden for over a century. Behind a false panel in the library, agents discovered a narrow passageway that led to a small, hidden room beneath the main staircase. Inside, they found documents that painted a very different picture of the Blackwood family history. The papers told a story of 3 generations of financial misconduct, tax evasion, and inheritance fraud. Julian hadn't just been the heir to a fortune. He had been the keeper of evidence that could have destroyed the family's reputation and landed several people in federal prison. Among the documents was a letter in Julian's handwriting, dated just 1 week before his disappearance, threatening to expose everything unless certain conditions were met. He was blackmailing his own family, Agent Rodriguez said in amazement as they read through the papers, threatening to go to the authorities unless they agreed to, what's this? Restructure the inheritance arrangements and dissolve the marriage contract. Margaret sat in her chair like a woman watching her world burn. Julian found those papers 3 months ago. He'd been holding them over our heads ever since, making demands, threatening to destroy everything our family built. So you killed him, Agent Chen said flatly. No, Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. I didn't kill him, but I may have helped him disappear. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. Julian hadn't been kidnapped or murdered. He had orchestrated his own disappearance with Margaret's reluctant assistance. Faced with his threats to expose the family's financial crimes, Margaret had agreed to transfer a substantial sum to an offshore account in exchange for Julian's promise to disappear permanently and never return to claim his inheritance. He said he was tired of being trapped by family expectations, Margaret admitted, her voice hollow with defeat. He wanted to start over somewhere else, with enough money to live comfortably, but without the burden of being a Blackwood heir. I thought it was better than watching our family name dragged through scandal. Julian had left through the hidden passage, emerging in the woods where a car waited to take him to a private airfield. By the time the household discovered his absence, he was already on a flight to Brazil under an assumed identity, carrying enough money to disappear forever. As the truth unfolded, Elspeth found herself in the surreal position of being both vindicated and devastated. Her prayers had been answered in the most unexpected way possible. Julian was gone, the marriage was impossible, and she was free. But the cost had been the destruction of the only family she had ever known, dysfunctional though it was. Standing in the mansion's main hall as FBI agents led Margaret away in handcuffs, Elspeth felt the weight of her new reality settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The Blackwood fortune would be frozen pending investigation, the mansion would likely be sold to pay restitution, and she would be alone again, but this time truly free to choose her own path. She looked up toward the 3rd floor, toward the dusty attic where she had knelt 3 nights ago and poured her heart out to the darkness. Sometimes, she realized, prayers are answered in ways we never expect, and freedom comes with a price we never imagined we'd have to pay. But as she walked toward the front door, toward an uncertain but chosen future, Elspeth Morrison smiled for the first time in years. Her prayer had been answered after all, just not in the way any of them had expected.